The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I have the biggest goalpost move, maybe of all time in politics, to tell you about today, and it has to do with our buddy Rudy Giuliani. Donald Trump's, one of Trump, I guess at this point he has 17, 18, 20 lawyers. It's not even clear what the total number is. One of those lawyers is Rudy Giuliani. And Rudy Giuliani is now saying he never said there was no Russian collusion. I have the clip for you, and this is now at historically pathetic and pretty embarrassing levels. So let's think back to the beginning, right? Don't forget that from the beginning, we were told there will be no Russia investigation. When one started, we were told the investigation is going to end quickly. It's not going to uncover any wrongdoing. Once the investigation found that actually people did break the law, we were told, well, no one's going to be convicted. But of course, then people were convicted. And at that point, the new goalpost move was, well, the convictions all are for things that took place before the 2016 election, and they don't have anything to do with Russia or the Trump campaign. But then, of course, that imploded, and I'm skipping over like a dozen other intermediate lies. But most recently, we learned that Donald Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was directly giving polling data and other data to Russians at minimum, never mind everything else that we've learned and continue to learn. So that gets us to yesterday. And at this point, we have Rudy Giuliani, Donald Trump's attorney, saying on live television to CNN's Chris Cuomo, he never denied that there was collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. He just meant Trump wasn't personally colluding. Take a look at this. And if you're watching, pay particular attention to the expression on Chris Cuomo's face as Rudy Giuliani denies having denied something that he actually denied countless times, that there was collusion. Stunned and perplexed doesn't even begin to cover Chris Cuomo's expression. Take a look.
Time they did that. The amount of false reporting about this case is despicable.
Mr. Mayor, false reporting is saying that nobody in the campaign had any contacts with Russia. False reporting is saying that there has been no suggestion of any kind of collusion between the campaign and any Russians. Because now you have Paul Manafort giving poll data that winds up leading to this coincidence.
Well, you just misstated my position. I never said there was no collusion between the campaign or between people in the campaign.
Yes,
I have no idea if I have not. I said the President of the United States. There is not a single bit of evidence the President of the United States committed the only crime you could commit here, conspired with the Russians to hack the DNC.
First of all, crime is not the bar of accountability.
I really hope that, like many of his other employees, Trump's not paying Rudy Giuliani, that he's been ignoring his legal bills, because this is just embarrassing what Rudy Giuliani is doing now. So the new story is, sure, plenty of campaign people colluded with Russia, but Trump personally never colluded with Russia. No one colluded with Russia except for Trump's campaign chairman, the deputy campaign chairman, Trump's longtime personal attorney, Michael Cohen, and a whole bunch of other smaller players. But what we meant all along when we said no collusion was that it's Trump who didn't collude. What TV channels should really be preparing for these interviews is clips of people saying stuff so that when they deny it, they can just go right to it. When Rudy Giuliani says, I never denied that there was collusion, they could go right to a supercut of him denying collusion, of Trump denying that anyone colluded, and get him to react to that. Here's just one example of this, okay? They could have dozens of these ready. Here's just one example.
Oh, you're not wrong, but Russia collusion was wrong with Donald Trump. Russian collusion is a total fake news. Unfortunately, it has become the basis of the investigation.
Right, but now he claims it's not something that he has ever denied. We've reached that stage, okay? There was no collusion, to there was no collusion, but it wouldn't be a crime anyway, to we never said there was no collusion. And when Rudy Giuliani goes on TV and moves the goalposts like this, to me, it signals something big is about to break, Pat, and they're trying to get ahead of it. Because you know what tomorrow is? Tomorrow is Mueller Grand Jury Friday. And so far, every time we've seen Giuliani do something like this, It's in advance of something terrible breaking.
I honestly think, though, that even if the news team had those clips ready, disproving what Rudy Giuliani is saying, showing that, yes, you did deny Trump-Russia collusion, I think he would just respond by saying the truth isn't the truth. He would move the goalposts even further. That's how pathetic this has gotten. Sean Hannity, on the other hand, he takes a different approach. He wraps it all up as a conspiracy, a deep state conspiracy. These are the different approaches that they're taking right now, and it's getting really bad.
You're probably right that even if you presented Giuliani with the clips, he would come up with something, argue the video's been doctored or it was taken out of context or whatever. And this is why politics is so toxic, and our elected officials and the system that we have such low approval ratings, because any normal person at this point would obviously have been indicted for their involvement in a criminal conspiracy to collude with Russia and to cover it up with obstruction of justice, with witness tampering, with the entire thing. But as the president, you have the benefit of Fox News and a right-wing media apparatus defending your every move all the time, period, no matter what you do. You have lawyers like Rudy Giuliani moving the goalposts so far that they're off the field and into the parking lot. It's really simple. We can tell what is right and wrong here. Everything about this is wrong, and any normal person would have been indicted already, but it's absolutely not guaranteed that there will be any consequences for the top people involved, because we have two justice systems in this country, as I've talked about many, many times before. Very strange stuff is happening at the White House. On the same day that ISIS claimed responsibility for a deadly attack in Syria, which killed a total of 4 people, including 2 American service members, and injured 3 others, Vice President Mike Pence declared victory over ISIS and simultaneously said, we're getting out of Syria and we're going to stick out the fight. How all of this stuff can be true, I have no idea. This is sort of another one of those mission accomplished moments. Remember when George W. Bush had one on the deck of an aircraft carrier, which was followed by 5,000 American service member deaths in Iraq? Not exactly mission accomplished. Pence yesterday was at the Global Chiefs Mission Conference at the U.S. State Department. Listen to what he said.
Thanks to the leadership of this commander-in-chief and the courage and sacrifice of our armed forces, we're now actually able to begin to hand off the fight against ISIS in Syria to our coalition partners, and we are bringing our troops home. The caliphate has crumbled and ISIS has been defeated.
Yeah, not a particularly confident teleprompter read from Mike Pence there, and the muted applause doesn't make it sound too much better. But the real problem is the fact, which is that we had an attack in Syria yesterday for which ISIS claimed responsibility. 4 people died, 3 people injured, 2 of the 4 dead American service members. And as far as what we know right now, a suicide bomber with an explosive vest matching the MO of ISIS, ISIS claiming responsibility. It's certainly not a good look to be bragging about the defeat of ISIS on the same day that you have to tell the families of service members that, at least initially, it appears as though ISIS has actually killed their loved ones. And of course, you can defend this by saying Pence didn't know that that had taken place at the time that he gave this speech. Very difficult to imagine. We don't know exactly what Pence knew and when he knew it, but the military operation confirmed the deaths of these service members hours before Pence spoke. They had issued a statement about it, and Pence doesn't even mention it here. And he could have at least said something like, despite the tragic deaths in Syria today of our valued service members, we are almost there with defeating ISIS, or something. It may not even have been true, but it at least would have implied a little bit more empathy and decorum than what Mike Pence did. Now, even weirder than what we just saw, if you can imagine it, is that later in this same speech, Pence says that we are getting out, but also that we're staying in the fight. I mean, it just makes no sense. Take a listen to it.
Now, we'll stay in the region and we'll stay in the fight to ensure that ISIS does not rear its ugly head again. We will protect the gains that our soldiers and our coalition partners have secured. But this president has often spoken about his desire to bring an end to endless wars in America and the ability to bring our troops home.
So we're going to end endless wars, but we're also going to stay in the fight, but we're leaving, but we're not leaving. I thought the whole point was that we weren't staying in the fight. This is doublespeak, the likes of which we would be used to reading in a George Orwell novel. We defeated ISIS, but I won't mention that ISIS killed 4 people today. But we're leaving and getting out of endless wars, like Trump said. But we're staying in the fight for as long as we need to stay in the fight. But Trump is against endless wars. Sort of brilliant in a weird way. Take every side of every issue. Let Fox News edit out the contradictions for the narrative that they spoon feed their audience. Let it get figured out later by right-wing media, or just not at all, and you're on record as having taken every position on multiple sides of an issue. And within 20 seconds, what this leads to is a vice president saying both, that we're bringing troops home and we're staying in the fight. Is this considered leadership? Is this considered resolve by the Trumpists? And depending on who's speaking and what's more advantageous, ISIS both has and has not been defeated, if you listen to what Mike Pence and others are saying. We're justifying leaving Syria by saying ISIS has been defeated. But if we want to show how big and strong and committed Trump is, we're saying we finished the job and we're going to stay as long as it takes. It sort of doesn't even matter because the lies are going unchecked and with no real consequences. So what's the disadvantage to just taking every position on all of these issues? Send me your thoughts. What the hell was Mike Pence talking about? I'm on Twitter at @DPakman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've got a lot of news to get to, but something that's very important that I would not want to ever miss doing is thanking some really great people. And today's new member of the day is William Scott Calkins. We do have this thing called membership. You've probably never heard me mention it because it just comes up so infrequently on the show, but that's mostly how the program is funded. And today's new member of the day is William Scott Calkins. And today's longtime sustaining member of the day, in the membership Hall of Fame, one might say, people are saying, Jason Begley. Jason Begley's been with us nearly 5 years. William and Jason, thank you. You can join them at www.joinpakman.com. We're talking about pennies a day, and you can save 40% off of that pennies a day rate with the coupon code THISIS2020. Okay, I like to keep up with what political issues are on the minds of our audience, and one place to do that is the David Pakman Show subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. This morning I was browsing new posts on the David Pakman Show subreddit. A couple interesting ones I want to point out. Does anyone else find the constant smearing of Lindsey Graham as a pedophile from straight lefties disgusting? Yeah, you know, I've actually mentioned before, okay, so it's rumored that Republican Senator Lindsey Graham is a gay guy. Fine. I don't care. I do find it disgusting anytime you see this double standard on gay rights from Republicans. But okay, whatever. Lindsey Graham may be a gay guy. That doesn't mean that he's a pedophile. And in the same way that the left typically defends against that dumb, tired, discriminatory talking point that if you're an adult and you're attracted to adult men, you're somehow also assumed to be into little kids. I do find it homophobic, and there are many things we can attack Lindsey Graham for. His completely unhinged rant during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, which it was unclear whether it was a political speech or a medical incident that he was having. That was nuts. Let's criticize him for that. Let's criticize him for his constant flip-flopping as to whether he agrees and approves of the job Trump is doing or whether he disagrees. There is no shortage of political issues on which Lindsey Graham deserves criticism. But Lindsey Graham is gay and therefore a pedophile. Come on, that is homophobic, and it's below the type of political speech that we should be engaging in. So I agree. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, China logs record trade surplus with the United States in 2018. Yeah, I meant to cover this as a standalone story, and we just got so busy this week with like 5 scandals a day that I didn't get to it. One of the stories we were told from Donald Trump about trade and China and the economy is that the Chinese trade deficit is bad, and that Trump would fix it, and that the tariffs would be part of the solution. And of course, none of it has happened. Trump doesn't get trade. The tariffs are a disaster. And in fact, the trade deficit with China has gone up during 2018. And of course, the tariffs were not fully implemented in 2018. But regardless, things moving in the exact opposite direction, we were told. No surprise whatsoever. Lastly, from the David Pakman Show subreddit, former guest of the show, Eric Turkheimer, pointed out on Twitter that there was once an IQ gap between the British and the Irish, some in the 1970s suggested was genetic, but now this gap has totally disappeared due to positive environmental changes. I also saw this, and you know what, Pat? I'm kind of bored and tired of the whole race and IQ thing. I get it. There's this movement called race realists. There are people who have been red-pilled and who like people like Charles Murray and Stefan Molyneux and all of the others, and they still want to argue about race and IQ and all of that stuff. We did our deep dive on it. We've talked about it a dozen times on the show. I'm finding myself bored by the topic and moving on to bigger and better things. Does this mean that you're not interested in having Eric Turkheimer back on the show to talk about this topic? Are you just that over it? I'm not finding it necessary to have Eric Turkheimer back, who was a great guest, and he addressed a lot of the bogus talking points about race and IQ. I don't even know that we need, I mean, it is very interesting that yet another one of these IQ differences that was alleged to be genetic now has been eliminated, and we can point to environmental factors for it. It's interesting. It's relevant to that discussion. I'm just finding the entire race and IQ thing not really relevant in general. If the audience disagrees and you're interested in, for example, follow-up with Eric Turkheimer about the Irish-British race and IQ gap, let me know, and we can look at reaching back out to Eric. But my instinct is that most of our audience is kind of beyond race and IQ. Participate in the discussion on the David Pakman Show subreddit, davidpakman.com/Reddit. I regularly visit the Reddit. I get story ideas from the Reddit. I engage with attackers of the David Pakman Show on the subreddit, all very politely, though. There are moderators, and we completely disallow bullying and obvious trolling. There's a funny little thing going on, which I want to tell you about, and it has nothing to do with Donald Trump's diet. It's that in American politics, there are lots of formalities that sort of don't really matter. So I'll give you an example. Did the losing presidential candidate concede? Because if they conceded, it's over. But if they didn't concede, they could still challenge the results. Oh, wait a second. No, the concession is merely symbolic. It's a formality. It doesn't really make any practical difference. I could give you many other of those examples. We have upcoming the yearly State of the Union address. And as I've mentioned before, when the President of the United States goes to the House of Representatives to give their State of the Union address, we've mentioned before that the Speaker of the House invites the President to come to the House chamber to brief the House and Senate about the State of the United States of America. It's normally a formality. Yes, an invitation letter is sent, and then the President shows up as expected. But we're quickly learning it's not just a formality, because if the Speaker doesn't invite the President or rescinds an invitation, the President can't just show up and give a speech. Right now, we find ourselves in a situation where government is shut down. Nancy Pelosi is the new Speaker of the House now that Democrats have been sworn in and have taken control in that chamber. And she's uninvited Trump from giving the State of the Union address via a letter that she sent yesterday. The formal reason she cites in the letter, which we're showing our television and video audience, the formal reason is that we've got a government shutdown going on. There are security concerns for having the president in the House chamber. You can sort of read between the lines if you want, and I think that that's exactly as designed. Right now, the State of the Union is scheduled for January 29, and Nancy Pelosi is suggesting or deciding that it will be postponed to another, quote, suitable date, or for Trump to just send a letter to deliver the entire speech in writing. This is a nice little strategic move, because the State of the Union speech would be used by Trump to propagandize about the border wall and about the so-called immigration crisis. And you might say, hold on, but David, every State of the Union is a political speech where the president is going to evangelize for what they want to see done. Yes, that's true. But we know that in this particular case, Stephen Miller and other advisors have been working on Trump's speech. There is every plan to have it be a cry, basically a build the wall rally of sorts. And Nancy Pelosi is saying the government shut down. You're not going to do it. And this is not without precedent. This isn't something Nancy Pelosi came up with herself out of thin air on a whim. The State of the Union has never been delivered during a government shutdown. Previously, it would frequently be delivered in writing. That's not really unique, novel, or new in any way. But on paper, the security explanation is completely defensible, even if we do read through it as a political thing. The Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen said that the State of the Union address is a national special security event, an NSSE, and that NSSEs require the full resources of the federal government. Right now, we're in a partial government shutdown. We don't have the full resources of the federal government. Secret Service, which implements security for NSSEs and DHS, haven't been funded for now something like 4 weeks. And what I really like about this, Pat, is that it's hitting Trump where it hurts, not letting him talk to cameras, which he loves, not allowing him to go in there and have everybody cheer for him, which he loves. There are lots of Trumpists who just have no idea what's going on, and they say, well, Trump's entitled to give the speech, and Nancy Pelosi can't do this. No, this is by invitation. Trump can submit his speech in writing. He can request a later date. But Nancy Pelosi is not asking here. Nancy Pelosi is telling, and that's it.
Yeah, the Constitution mandates that the president keep Congress up to date on what's going on in the country from time to time. It doesn't say that it has to be every year. And I think this is definitely a politically savvy move on the part of Nancy Pelosi because, as you pointed out, there are times during the speech where both chambers, both parties are cheering the president, and that's definitely going to make him look good, which Democrats certainly don't want. And then, of course, corporate media is going to go on and on about how the president gave such a great speech, and that could up his approval rating, get people to side with him on the government shutdown. It would not be good for the Democratic Party.
Well, let's talk about the Pelosi part, because there are emails that I'm starting to get and tweets that I'm starting to see saying Pelosi's bungling it. She's going too hard against Trump with the shutdown and the State of the Union and all of this stuff. For everybody who thinks Nancy Pelosi is messing up with how she's behaved since she became Speaker of the House, you are very, very wrong. Nancy Pelosi's approval is going up the more she opposes Trump, particularly on the shutdown and on border wall funding, the more her approval goes up. She's doing the right thing here. She's not letting the petulant child Donald Trump get away with his antics. I've never been a massive Nancy Pelosi fan on policy. I'm to her left and feel she's too conservative on many issues, but she's not caving and giving Republicans and Trump what they want, and people are reacting to it positively. So you can argue you think that these are long-term strategic mistakes or that they are sort of debasing and coarsening the politics of the United States. You could make all those cases if you want, although I would respond and say that Donald Trump's been doing the exact same thing. But to argue that, at least in the short term, these are good decisions by Nancy Pelosi goes directly counter to the approval numbers that we're seeing. If I'm missing something about it, let me know. The David Pakman Show is on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Make sure that you follow us there for, what do we have there? Behind the scenes pictures, polls. I sometimes will answer questions from viewers on the Instagram account, David Pakman Show. We have pictures of Pat's Pat Cave at the studio, which a lot of people like, and it also helps to ensure Pat's safety. He's not just in a pitch black room surrounded by equipment. Lots of cool stuff on the David Pakman Show Instagram at David Pakman Show. And while you're there, follow me. I'm on Instagram at david.pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Erwin Chemerinsky, who's the Dean and Distinguished Professor of Law at UC Berkeley School of Law, also author of the book, We the People, How the Constitution is a Progressive Document that Can Be Adapted to the 21st Century. This is so great to have you on. I think maybe we could start with the adaptation part and then get to the progressive part. There is an argument from so-called constitutional originalists who believe that the correct interpretation of the Constitution is very little interpretation. In other words, that it should be interpreted strictly, literally, in the way that someone writing it in the 18th century would have intended. Now, I know you don't agree with that, but let's lay out the case against constitutional originalism.
To start with, the text of the Constitution is written in very broad, open-ended language. What's cruel and unusual punishment? What's due process of law? What's equal protection? You're not going to find answers to that in the text of the Constitution, nor are you going to find it in the views of those who wrote the Constitution in 1787 or wrote the Bill of Rights in 1791. That assumes that they had a common understanding and an agreement. And the reality is so many people were involved in the process. There were many different views. There was no single intent to be found. Even if we could find it, constitutional rights are never absolute. There's always a question of balancing them against competing interests. Finally, the reality is it would be absurd to be governed by the views from those in 1787 or 1791. That was a time of an agrarian slave society. How can their views govern us in our modern 21st century world? Give you examples. Article 2 of the Constitution refers to the president and vice president with the pronoun he. The framers of the Constitution clearly intended that the president and vice president would be male. Does that mean that it's unconstitutional to elect a woman as president or vice president until the Constitution is amended? The same Congress that voted to ratify the 14th Amendment also voted to segregate the District of Columbia public schools. Does that then mean that Brown versus Board of Education was wrongly decided? Any method of interpretation that makes Brown wrongly decided is obviously one that has to be rejected.
Let's go back to one example you gave, which is that of cruel and unusual punishment. A layperson's interpretation of unusual would sound contextual, meaning unusual relative to something, some standard, some prevalent form of punishment that is what is typically done. Is that lay understanding of what unusual means relevant to our understanding of constitutional originalism or not, or do we need to apply a different definition of what unusual would mean?
It's relevant, but I don't know how helpful it is. The first case I ever argued in the Supreme Court was Lockyer versus Andrade. My client, Leandro Andrade, was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 50 years for stealing $153 worth of videotapes from Kmart stores in San Bernardino, California. He received this sentence even though he'd never committed a violent crime. He received the sentence even though no one in the history of the United States had ever received a life sentence for shoplifting until California's three strikes law. I would think that makes it unusual. I think it's cruel. The Supreme Court 5-4 rejected that argument and upheld the sentence, the five conservative justices then being on the court, comprising the majority.
I'm curious when it comes to your view as to the double standard that I see often that exists with so-called constitutional originalists. I'll give you one example, and then I'll let you tell me whether this example is relevant or not, or maybe there are others. If one believes in a strict originalist interpretation of the Constitution, wouldn't that follow that with, as one example, with the Second Amendment, by definition, any lax interpretation in terms of what types of firearms that exist today that didn't in the 18th century would be interpretations beyond what was possible when it was originally written? Is that a fair critique, or is there something missing?
I think it's fair, but I'd even go to a prior question in terms of the meaning of the Second Amendment. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's clear what the purpose was of the Second Amendment, protecting a right to have guns for the purpose of malicious service. And yet it's the conservative originalist justices, like Antonin Scalia, who wanted to say, oh, we'll ignore the first half of the Second Amendment. It's only the latter language about the right to keep people to keep and bear arms that's relevant. But if we were going to protect arms, does that then just mean the kind of weapons that existed in 1791? When we talk about freedom of the press, does that apply to the new media that's developed since 1791? Obviously, for the First Amendment to have meaning, it has to apply to all of the media. It wouldn't make sense if there's a Second Amendment right to limit it to the weapons that existed in 1791.
I've pointed out that with many political arguments, like, for example, taxes or abortion, there's a kind of systemic messaging advantage that the right has. And what I mean by that is, as an example, with taxes, hey, it's your money, you should get to keep it. The lower the taxes, the better off we are. That's very concise, pithy, and appealing in many ways. The left, on the other hand, is not advocating the opposite, which is the more taxes, the better. It's, well, we need to find the right balance of what's fair, but what properly funds the institutions of government. So we're already kind of in a more complex position. When it comes to this issue of constitutional originalism, does the right have the same advantage in the sense that they say, hey, interpret it as written, period? And the left's position is not the opposite. It's not whatever you think it means is what it means. It's you're already sort of at a structural disadvantage.
Well, the right has a simplistic slogan. Judges should apply the law, not make the law. Justices should be umpires. We should just follow the framers' intent. But of course, all of that is a big lie. Everyone knows that justices and judges make the law as well as apply it. Supreme Court justices aren't umpires. They're the ones who make the rules, not just the ones who apply it. They have to balance competing interests all the time, whereas baseball umpires don't have to do that. And originalists, conservatives don't follow originalism when it doesn't serve their purpose. Yet, liberals don't have a pithy, easy way to describe their approach to constitutional interpretation.
Yes. So what's the answer? In other words, how would you advise the left to discuss this issue?
First, show that the right is an emperor with no clothes, that they're not doing what they say they're doing. And second, that it would be very undesirable to do what they say they're doing. What they would be saying is make Brown versus Board of Education unconstitutional. It would make it unconstitutional if the woman is president or vice president. So I think we need to show the emptiness of what they proposed. And ultimately, throughout American history, very few Supreme Court justices have been originalists. What the Supreme Court has done for over 200 years is look at the text, look at the intent, look at tradition, look at precedent, look at contemporary policy needs, and use those to decide the meaning of the Constitution. It's always been that way, and the left just has to defend that's the way it should be.
So let's talk about another aspect that the left, I think, should be defending when it comes to the Constitution, which goes to the argument you make in your book, which is that the Constitution is actually a progressive document. A quick glance at the 3/5 clause, some of the gender-related elements that you mentioned, much of what is in the Constitution interpreted literally, doesn't sound super progressive, at least by 2019 standards. So how do we make the case that this is actually a progressive document?
I think the Constitution is a vessel, and it can be interpreted in a progressive way or it can be interpreted in a conservative way. I think that the preamble to the Constitution tells us the values that it's meant to achieve: democratic governance, effective government, justice, liberty, and I would add to that equality. And I think that what we should be doing is interpreting the Constitution to further those values. And the book that you mentioned that I've written is titled We the People, a progressive reading of the Constitution for the 21st century. And I think there's a very important distinction. I do think that the Constitution was meant to be a progressive document, but to me what's key is how we interpret and read it now.
When it comes to what can be done more structurally today with regard to the Supreme Court in particular, and moving in the direction of having a group of justices that do interpret the Constitution in a way that's consistent with what you outline, court packing is increasingly mentioned, the idea of increasing the number of Supreme Court justices. What's your view on that tactic, and is it part of a broader strategy that could potentially backfire?
I think it's something that progressives should think about, but I don't think it's something progressives should talk about until after the 2020 election. In terms of thinking about it, if Democrats take the presidency in both houses of Congress in 2020, I think they need to think about whether they want to increase the size of the Supreme Court. The seat that Justice Scalia had is really a stolen seat. It should have been Merrick Garland confirmed for that. Never before in American history had the Senate said that it wouldn't even hold hearings or a vote on a candidate for the Supreme Court.
Yes.
So I think that Democrats have a strong argument saying, given how Republicans changed the rules, this is a stolen seat. We're going to increase the size. The size of the Supreme Court is set by statute, not by the Constitution. 9 is just a historical accident, and so there's nothing magical about it.
The sort of reflexive response often is, okay, well, Democrats could do that at their next opportunity, but then Republicans could simply do it again ad infinitum. Right. Is that a problem?
That's right. It is. And I think that's why Democrats have to think twice about it. If Democrats increase it to 11, if the Republicans take the presidency in Congress in 2024, they could make it 13, and so on. Is it worth opening that door? What would be the politics of it? But I want to go back to something I said. I don't think that progressives should be talking about this right now.
Yeah.
I think all it does is encourage conservatives to come out and vote so that they can have the court. Exit polls in 2016 showed that the number one reason that those who voted for Trump gave was the Supreme Court. 54% of Trump voters said that the Supreme Court was the reason that they voted for him. I don't think we should fuel that for 2020.
Yeah, well, so that gets us to something I think was not talked about enough in 2016, which is that there were divisions on the left about whether or not the Supreme Court was so important that it justified, for example, voting for Hillary Clinton, even though maybe your choice from the Democratic primary was not on that final ballot. There was a contingent on the left, which I believe did not take seriously enough the importance of the Supreme Court. Case in point, we're seeing that influence right now. How can we turn that around? Because as you point out, the exit polls confirmed the people who voted for Trump understood the importance of the Supreme Court.
You're absolutely right. Of those who voted for Trump, it was the number one reason they gave. For those who voted for Hillary Clinton, it was only number 4 in terms of reasons why people voted for Hillary Clinton. Republicans have done such a better job of getting out the message that one of the most long-lasting, important things the president does is put justice on the Supreme Court and judges on the lower federal courts. Democrats and liberals have not perceived it to the same extent.
Why?
And we're seeing now the consequences of that with Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. They could have been 2 progressives in those seats.
Why don't the progressives and Democrats and liberals understand the importance of that?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's totally beyond me, and one of the mysteries that I simply cannot understand. We've been speaking with Erwin Chemerinsky, who's Dean and Distinguished Professor of Law at UC Berkeley School of Law. We are linking in the description for this video to his latest book. So great to speak to you today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The World Health Organization has published its list of the biggest health threats that are facing the world in 2019. And anti-vaccine movements have caused what is being described by the WHO as vaccine hesitancy. And it has made the list of the top 10 health threats facing the world in 2019. We've been covering the anti-vaccine movement for years at this point. We've done multiple long-form videos about it. We've covered individual anti-vaccine sort of enclaves in the United States. We've talked about anti-vaccine sentiment from the left and from the right. And that's an important piece of what is making this such a big health threat, which is that anti-vaccine sentiment exists on the left and on the right for different reasons. And this is one of the most interesting elements of the movement, aside from it being horribly destructive. It's also politically interesting because you have right-wing anti-vaxxers who are more on the side of wanting a religious exemption from vaccines or distrusting the recommendations of a government for what vaccines you should get. So anti-government ideology is what causes a lot of right-wing anti-vaxxers to coalesce and activate. On the left wing of politics, though, you see distrust of corporations, including the ones that make the vaccines, and also some mistrust more generally of Western medicine in some enclaves as left-wing opposition to vaccination. So you have a coalition of left and right against vaccines. It's still comparatively small, but you see both left and right as parts of it for very different reasons. And it's ultimately just sad that we even have to do this story and that this problem exists, but it exists and it's a huge problem. And when we talk about the measles breakouts that we've seen, whooping cough, other conditions related to the anti-vaccine movement, it has now escalated to a worldwide threat. The percentage of kids who have received no vaccinations is quadrupling, has quadrupled over the last 18 years. And this is not just a problem in the United States, it's also a problem we've talked about it as a problem in Italy. I've read that it's a problem in Australia. We've talked about some of the other countries where this is taking hold. And it's really important to understand the company that anti-vaccine sentiment shares on this list of the world's biggest health threats for 2019. Ebola is on the list. Dengue is on the list. Antimicrobial resistance is on the list. A global flu pandemic is one of the biggest 2019 health threats to the world. Non-communicable disease like cancer and heart disease and diabetes. And then you have parents who choose not to get their kids vaccinated as one of the biggest health threats of 2019. This is how bad it has gotten. And although the anti-vaccine movement is not huge in terms of its percentage, like if you look at the entire US, for example, it's a very small percentage of all parents who are refusing vaccination for their kids. But in a country of 340 million people, even a group that is small as a percentage of the population can still be very loud. They can still have a big impact because of something called herd immunity within the world of vaccination. And case in point, if you look at the comments on many articles about this list that I'm telling you about today, you actually see outrageous anti-vaccine comments. There are thousands of comments saying things like vaccines are bad. I know someone who got the flu vaccine and 3 days later they had the flu. That's still something that people are saying publicly. And I'm not going to do, Pat, our entire 5-year repertoire on vaccines other than to say that in the world of coherent narratives, anti-vaxxers have stumbled onto a catchy story. And we've talked about this before, Pat. You have people on the left and right who, for different reasons, are skeptical of vaccines. There are some conditions, medical conditions, that we don't yet fully understand, like, for example, autism, which has become very popular to blame on vaccines. And then you combine that with social media, which allows the disinformation and misinformation to spread very quickly. This is the impact that anti-vaccine movements have now caused vaccine hesitancy to be on the list of the biggest health threats to the world in 2019.
So I'm not sure if we would classify anti-vaxxers as conspiracy theorists, although there are certainly elements of conspiracy to their theories on vaccines. But I wonder if because the World Health Organization has labeled it such a big health threat, if they will actually be reinvigorated in their views because of that, if it would actually be somewhat counterproductive, because the anti-vaxxer community will take a look at that labeling and say, look, the government's against us here. We must be doing something right.
Yeah, that, unfortunately, we are going to have a really good long-form piece in partnership with Natan Pakman's Natan's Notes YouTube channel about how conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking works. And exactly as Pat is pointing out here, whatever evidence comes forward, or even lack of evidence, once someone is committed to a conspiracy theory, doesn't matter what comes to light, it's all evidence of the conspiracy theory. And that is absolutely going to happen here. And I know that when I talk about this, there's a fraction of our audience that disagrees with me. Every time I bring it up, I get angry emails. But this is a blind spot for some people on the left and some people on the right. It's not something I'm going to pretend isn't going on. And as evidence of how serious it is, the WHO, which is not making these decisions politically, it's making these decisions based on the science, is now saying this is a global threat. Anti-vaccine movements have become a global health threat. I've talked before about how there's been a worldwide move away from the United States dollar in the world of currencies. And in November of last year, we did a big story about this where I explained that the dollar sort of has this privileged position, which is good for people in the United States. It's used as a trading currency in a lot of the world. 2/3 of global reserves are in dollars. 2/3 of all physical dollar bills are outside of the U.S. So the point of the story I did back in November is that there's significant global reliance on the dollar, and that this is good for the United States in a few ways. It helps to keep interest rates low. It makes selling bonds easy because so many countries around the world already have dollars. It makes our exports worth more because there is more demand for our currency. It gives us geopolitical negotiating clout. It's positive for us in a bunch of different ways. But partially because of Donald Trump's tariffs, world countries have started to move away from the dollar, which is not good for the United States in a number of ways. Not only has the story been growing, it's actually now sort of tying into Russia's manipulations and the positioning of China geopolitically. Because remember that the context here is Russia's geopolitics for decades have been to sow discord in the United States, carry out, I guess we would call them initiatives, to make people question the stability of our democratic systems. We saw them do that with the 2016 election, create tension, create conflict, and they've been doing it really, really well. And what Russia is now doing economically is shifting their financial reserves away from the United States dollar and towards the Chinese yuan, which will be yet another way in which they are going to help destabilize the United States, as well as euros and some Japanese yen. What Russia did back in April, we just learned about it now, or maybe it was later in 2018, is they sold about $100 billion in U.S. holdings from its reserves, and they shifted that $100 billion into Chinese yuan, euros, and yen. This is not just an economic decision. And economically, it may not even be that great for them in the short run, but it is part of their geopolitical tactics and strategy and the antics that they've become known for. Part of this is, well, if they sell some of their U.S. dollars, they'll be less exposed to U.S. sanctions against them. If you don't have as many U.S. dollars, you're less impacted by those American sanctions. But the political aspect of this goes beyond that, because Putin said just a couple of months ago, quote, "We aren't ditching the dollar is ditching us," which of course is interesting in the sense that he is saying, well, there are elements of the dollar that are not good for us to hold it as a reserve currency, but it's all part of the geopolitical play that Putin is doing. And I have to tell him, it's sort of genius, right? I mean, in a way, this is a multi-pronged attack. In every way, Putin has Trump and the U.S. over a barrel. And I want to be really clear, because I know people will write in and say, David, you know, you're understating the fact that this move could be bad for Russia economically. That's right. If you evaluate this decision that Russia's making to get away from the dollar, only short-term economics, it could actually be bad for Russia. The yields on some of the currencies Russia's shifting to are lower than yields on the US dollar. In the short term, this might actually hurt Russia economically to some degree. But in geopolitics, that really doesn't matter. The dollar's not doomed. The dollar's going to be fine whether or not Russia shifts reserves in or out. It's the clout and the positioning of the United States that's increasingly in question on the world stage. One way in which the dollar and our bonds could be headed to a downgrade is if the shutdown continues. I read a couple of pieces suggesting that our credit rating could be downgraded if the shutdown goes on much longer. Putin is actually the guy who is playing the 4D chess in a way that Trump can't conceive of. I wish it weren't the truth. It doesn't make me happy to come to you and say, look at the clever stuff Putin is doing to have the United States and Trump over a barrel. But he's doing it, and he's actually doing it pretty well. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail I got about how I deal with callers to the David Pakman Show. Take a listen.
Hey, David. I'm a big fan of the show. I just wanted to call in and ask you not to be, well, I guess I can ask this. What are your tips for dealing with the rude callers who call you probably on a daily basis? Because I just quit my job. I worked in the service industry. And, well, okay. How do you deal with rude people who call into your show?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the right person to ask, because a lot of people criticize me for not dealing with callers well. I mean, that's a common criticism, that I'm either not giving someone enough time to lay out their question, even if they want 5 minutes to lay out a question when I've got 30 people holding, or that I am being condescending sometimes to callers. So I don't know that I'm the right person. I try to do the best I can and sort of balance the level of hostility of the caller with whether they're actually providing a question or comment of value, with how I assume or infer that the rest of the audience is dealing with this caller. And I just try to do the best I can, but no matter what, I get criticized. If I rush callers off too quickly when they're not making a point, people write in and say, David, you're being rude to the callers. If I allow people to do soliloquies uncontrolled for minutes on end, I get emails saying, David, you know, you really got to learn how to take control of these callers. You can't allow them to just go on and monopolize the show like that. So what I've come to realize is that my handling of callers is sort of a no-win scenario. And I just need to do the best I can. And certainly, listen, if you work in customer service at a call center, the last thing you should be doing for the sake of your job is to be taking guidance from me during live calls as to how to handle customer service calls. Very, very different situation. The live callers can't fire me, although I guess the audience could, in the sense that if they really don't like how I handle calls, they could cancel memberships. But the last thing I would ever recommend someone do is to look at my live calls to figure out how to do customer service as a job. Definitely don't do that. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Very sad news from the world of index funds. Vanguard's founder, John Bogle, has passed away. And this is someone whose work I have followed for a very long time, and who has an investment philosophy, along with the late, great Ben Graham, that is basically my investment philosophy. And we'll talk about that on today's bonus show. We will also talk about a hotel dishwasher who has been awarded $21 million after her boss made her work on Sundays. And lastly, on today's bonus show, Netflix is increasing subscription prices. It's churning out a lot of original content, some of which I am not finding to be that good, and also pulling non-original content that I really like. So we will talk about what's going on with Netflix and much more on today's bonus show. 2 ways to get access to the bonus show. Number 1, become a member at www.joinpakman.com. Number 2, become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.